yesterday evening we had a dinner with a couple of colleagues and here from Ponars, and we did spontaneously remember our seniors, our teachers, the ones who hired us, the ones who taught us, the ones who protected us, mentored us, and so on. And there were so many interesting anecdotes reflecting well on them and on their sense of generosity that they actually showed. One name that comes to mind here is Jim Millar, who was a long-term director of this institute and who knew the field like very few other people. And when you asked him something, he could tell you tons about not just actually anecdotes, but also about how the discipline developed. So I think that apart from kind of helping us feel the sense of community, which I think is very important for Ponars in particular, right? That we belong to a community, the Ponars members belong to a community, Institute members belong to this community and carry on something that others have started. The intellectual component is the disciplinary history, which of course is part of intellectual history. And intellectual history has not been given a lot of institutional support in the United States. I think it's a much more honored field in many European countries. And so it seems to me that as a cornerstone of intellectual history in the field of area studies, Russia, Eurasia, and so on, this is really important. And if possible, other institutes should probably do the same. I remember last year when we celebrated 20th anniversary of Ponars, several of us were standing together, and of course I only began to have something to do with Ponars when I became Institute Director in 2012, so I don't remember the time before, but we all tried to put together elements of that history, kind of reconstruct it, and it turned out it's not so easy. Even the most recent years are really difficult to reconstruct. So probably something going in the direction of reconstructing the history of Ponars would in itself be really interesting, because of course the atmosphere and the goals and the level of support and the expectations from this organization have changed over the years. Right? So if I may ask, the first question before we open the floor is, are there legal implications? When you publish something, when people say, oh, and that person, he was so kind of unhygienic, and the breakfast you can see from his tie, and so on. And we say these things, but then there will be online and so on. Isn't that something where you could really run into difficulties? Do you need the agreement, the permission of the interviewee for making this public and so on?
It's a great question, and it's one that the oral history field in general has a very long experience with. In fact, we do this in the social sciences and the humanities all the time when we do interview-based work and field research work, because in a lot of it we often will identify the people we've spoken to, and even if we're not slandering their hygiene, we're often making them we're portraying them in a bad political light, which can have consequences as well. The good thing is that people in oral history have thought about this a lot more than others, partly by virtue of a very negative case that took place in Boston over a series of IRA interviews. I encourage those of you who haven't heard about this case to look it up, because a lot of people got in trouble over the things that they revealed in there. And I've taken part in some oral history projects that to this day remain closed. Well, not the entire projects, but large portions of those projects, simply because of political fallout or legal implications that may result. In one case, a project involving resettlement of people that had been released from a certain facility, and that we simply couldn't release the interview transcripts because their lawyers were afraid. They hadn't said anything shocking or upsetting, but they were very critical of the countries that had agreed to host them, because they felt that those countries didn't fulfill their promises. And the lawyers were afraid not that there would be a lawsuit, but that the countries would read these transcripts and not be willing to take other people that had been released, because they were complaining about them. So there are lots of implications, legal, moral, and ethical, and otherwise, that you have to think about. You have to think about this from the outset. In some cases, IRB committees are involved. Not in all cases. In some cases, IRB committees give institutes blanket go-aheads to do oral history projects. But the field of oral history protects its narrators or interviewees through one very significant way. A good oral history project lays out the objectives to the people that we're interviewing. We're very upfront with what we're trying to do. We explain to them what the outcome is. We explain to them when we hope to have it published, and we always give them the right to review the transcript, to edit, and to redact. So I've interviewed somebody who was so candid, this was somebody in the publishing business, who was so candid about his work. It was what he described as a career-killing interview, that he decided to embargo it for 25 years, simply so that he can continue to work to retirement. And then it can be opened up. Now, he doesn't say anything that would land anybody in jail, of course, but but in an era of ghostwriting, it would cause some embarrassment to very prominent people that put their names under things that they haven't written themselves because it's been ghostwritten for them. Things like this. So in oral history, we are extremely aware of this. We take great pains to protect the narrators, and in some cases, and this is quite interesting, in some cases when you see a narrator struggling with the words because the story is so painful, or they're afraid of what might happen when it's released, you will stop the interview if you're a good interviewer, or you will take out the flashcard and hand it to them and say, that's okay, we'll do this when you're ready. You carry a lot of responsibility on your shoulders.
Okay, we have a question here. Can we get a microphone here, please?
I was wondering if you ever, so I'm Leo Chilpafone, Vice President here. So I was wondering to what degree you have looked at how two individuals who have collaborated on something over many years, when they give their accounts, the accounts are very different of what actually happened. It's very well known in science that people who have collaborated and won a Nobel Prize, say a team of two, they're required to give a talk when they get the prize, and they not uncommon in a major dispute. No, that was my idea. No, remember I told you that. And it's fascinating reading. So a prime example is Watson and Crick, probably the biggest discovery in biology ever. Very different accounts of who came up with the initial model, how it happened, and so on. And I wonder to what degree you found that in your work.
That's also a great question. Now, broadly speaking, oral history is not investigative journalism. So that lets us off the hook, but only a little bit. Because you are still supposed to do a lot of background research before you interview people. And if there's a case where it's unclear who is responsible for what, then it is your responsibility to push them on it. You only push so much though, because if you push people too much on it, they shut down, and then the purpose of the interview is derailed. You don't get the richness and the depth. One other way to think of oral history is that sure, the oral historian has to do research and ask the right questions and take a certain responsibility to parse out who did what, but the transcript is also a primary source. And so a good oral historian who puts up the data, much like a good statistician who puts up all the data so that all of her collaborators and people around her can see it, we do the same thing, and we leave it up to you to do the research and to decide. So we do it halfway, we have to do it the fuller way.
And Watson and Crick both won, right? This is the good thing about it. So both of them won. Yes?
Hi, I'm Laura Kennedy. I'm Laura Kennedy. I'm a former U.S. Career diplomat. And if you'll permit me, I have a question, a commercial, and a proposal. But first of all, thank you for your work in establishing this oral history archive, which I think will be a signal contribution. My question is, in your work, have you worked with the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training on their oral archive? My commercial is that for those who aren't familiar with it, they do oral histories of diplomats. It's online. They work just similarly to what you've described with your guidelines. It's adst.org, and I wanted to make this commercial because obviously we have practitioners, we have students, we have teachers. It is a huge treasure trove that covers obviously all of diplomacy, but there's a huge chunk, believe me, of former Soviet, Russian, Central Asia, Caucasus, Ukraine, etc. So as I say, I wanted to give that pitch for them. My proposal is, because I myself am such a devotee of this field, which I think, by the way, is getting increasingly, I see reference in various books that I read for the American Academy of Diplomacy for their annual prize. But I think it needs to be used more, and this whole field. So my proposal is possibly next year, you could do a panel on oral history with the Harriman, with ADST. I know the Miller Center at UVA has a big oral history, and there's probably all sorts of others out there, because I think it would benefit all, this broad community to have greater familiarity with this treasure trove. So again, thank you for your great work at Harriman.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up ADST because, well, very few people know how many institutes do great oral histories. And the Miller Center, which you mentioned, is another great example. The Columbia Center for Oral History has a wonderful archive of hundreds of oral history projects. Everything from notable New Yorkers to a project on LGBT communities and how they organize. There's like a full range of things. I think the idea of a panel is wonderful, and I think that's for Ponars to decide if that's something Ponars wants to take on. And I can also talk to Alex at Harriman about this as well.
Great.
Oh, can I say one more thing before I forget? A few years ago, when I was working with the Holling Center, a small NGO that does dialogues on critical issues, we actually did a dialogue on oral history, how you do oral history in settings of conflict and high-risk settings. And one of the people we had was, I don't know if he's still there, but he was the State Department's resident oral historian, a wonderful guy. And it was a really great discussion, and we came out with a very nice publication by virtue of his feedback as well, that is a guide to how to do such deep narrative interviews in high-risk settings or kind of tougher settings of war and conflict or authoritarian settings. So that's something I can certainly point people to as well if they're interested. Thank you for your suggestion.
Wayne Berry, I have a comment and a suggestion. My comment is that Alexander Cooley's too young to do an oral history. He's a kid, come on. My suggestion is a follow-up on Laura's, which is, I'm a great believer in oral histories, and I'm really sad when I see an extraordinary number of people whose memories are being lost because we're in a world in which people don't keep diaries, people don't write letters like they used to, and there's a world before emails came along, but after people stopped writing letters, that only can be handled by oral history. But one of the things that's needed is for institutes like Harriman, like Foreign Service Oral History Project, to start doing digital linking. Not just so that when you pull up the Harriman Institute page, there are ways for you to find out about other oral history projects that cover some of the same material, of which the Foreign Service one is a prime example. But so that students don't have to hunt so much, and so that you can, with increasing digital sophistication, even go for topics. For example, I happen to know that the events of August 1991 are in great detail handled in oral history projects that the State Department is sponsoring. Mine goes on for about 50 pages. But I start it by saying that anyone looking at this needs to look at the oral histories of the following half dozen people, because you get a Rashomon effect on this. And that Rashomon effect is actually part of history. And anyone going into yours ought to be able to do hyperlinks to other oral history projects looking at specific historic events. And I think that that is becoming technologically possible. And particularly, you look up there a photograph of Averell Harriman. Quite a few of his successors as occupants of Spaso House have done oral histories, but they're probably not on your website. But they ought to be accessible from your website.
It's a wonderful comment, it's a wonderful suggestion. This is just the initial iteration of the website, and I'm glad that you're saying it as emphatically as you're saying it, because the more comments like that we get, I think the more Alex and I are willing to put in the labor to do this. While this is an oral history that is about the Harriman and its affiliates, the findings and implications go way beyond the Harriman, and I'm all for linking it, and we're going to make a concerted effort to do this. But this brings up a broader point that I think really is a bad thing about the discipline of oral history. That a lot of oral historians, be they graduate students or faculty in the field who publish many wonderful books, they will grab a subject, they'll put it together, and they'll rush to implement it without thinking about how they're going to archive it, present it, and disseminate it. But the thing about oral history is from the moment you've picked up a recorder and are about to hit the record button, you've made yourself an archivist. You basically have to commit from the outset how you're going to archive it, how you're going to disseminate it, and how you are going to present it to the world. You're right, technologically, the field is, even though oral history sounds a little bit old-fashioned, the field is so highly digitized. They're doing such wonderful work with automated transcripting, with linking video to automatically generated transcripts, and kind of like multi-visual, multi-level linking of documents. So it's very possible to do this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for wonderful presentation. I have also some kind of questions and suggestion. Have you ever heard about University of Indiana Center for Oral History and Memory? It was founded by one of our graduates, one of Georgetown graduates. He interviewed hundreds of Jews in Western Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. Those who went through, I forgot the name, traditional Jewish schools, and then went to a Soviet yeshiva, and then went to the Soviet school. So they went in the morning, they studied at these traditional schools, and then they went to Soviet schools, and everything what they learned at Jewish schools, and teachers then explained to them that everything what they learned was not true. It's a fascinating recording. There are hundreds of YouTube clips. I was just wondering if you saw anything like that. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I have Joshua Tucker from NYU, director of the Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia at NYU. I have two sort of very different questions. The first follows actually nicely on what everyone's been talking about right now, which is I'm just kind of curious how much emphasis you've put at this stage, and if you haven't, sort of to make these machine readable, all the transcripts, and where the field is. So it sounds like there's a lot of interesting things going on here, not just in terms of linkages, but in terms of having protocols for metadata and having the same metadata on different transcripts, because that's what will make all of this stuff. If you want to search by topics, it's the metadata that does that, and if you can have the metadata standardized in how machines read it, that would be fantastic. Then from a totally different perspective, not the technology side at all, I mean, it's interesting as someone who got his PhD hanging out at the Davis Center at Harvard, right? The idea that we're going to have this amazing oral history of Harriman, and people are going to look back on that as the history of the sort of Russian studies evolution field. I mean, I know you guys did this for Harriman and for the anniversary at Harriman, but it seems like you have a possibility here, right? There were a few of these big type, centers that were set up in the aftermath of World War II. I had the real pleasure when I was at Princeton of getting to talk to Bob Tucker, who I'm not related to, although my dad was also named Bob Tucker, just a small coincidence. But talking to him about his experiences at Harvard in the early 40s, and it was fascinating, so super interesting. So I think it would be, I'm just sort of curious, like, from the point of view of Harriman, this is wonderful. From the point of view of the Russian studies field, and given all the sort of rivalries that seem to exist in Russian studies, just having this sort of Harriman thing out there is this is the history of Russian studies, how it developed, these things. If you talk to people at like Davis, or you talk to people at Berkeley, or even at Princeton or some of these places about trying to replicate this a little bit, because it seems like, given the tremendous role Harriman played in this, you have a really big head start to trying to capture something much larger. But if it stops with this, there will be sniping. There will be, there will be people who are saying you're showing one side of the picture and not other side. So interested in both of those. But thanks, this is really interesting.
Yeah, so the whole issue of machine readability, metadata, and standardization is a big one, and it actually occupies tons of panels at the annual Oral History Association conference. And that's something that you should attend at some point, because I think you would find so many interesting crossovers with your work. So far, what's up here are Microsoft Word and PDF versions, which are readable, but not in the cross-cutting way that you're talking about. And like I said, it's the first version. Alex and I are going to figure out, as we do phase 2, how to make it a little bit more savvy and a little bit easier to negotiate and to cross-link with all these other things. The difficult thing that you and many others of you know is if you get too far down to setting something up, it becomes hard to dismantle it and to redo it. So now is the time for us to have this discussion.
And it's the answer to people not paying enough attention to it. This is the way
Exactly.
to get a lot more people to pay attention.
And then the other way, and we're also trying to think through, okay, how can we encourage people to use this? So for example, one of the things that Alex is doing is that he's starting to do some pilots in his classrooms with getting students to do research projects on the basis of the transcripts to see what kind of inventive stuff undergraduates themselves are able to do with this. And sometimes, you learn the most from the youngest students who have completely unfiltered in different ways of looking at things. Regarding Davis, Davis came up in a lot of the interviews because a lot of these people, Harriman doesn't have a monopoly on them, right? They went on to teach at Davis, to work at Davis, to Berkeley in some cases. And so even somebody who is an affiliate isn't necessarily a Harriman devotee or a Harriman loyalist. And so Alex and I are starting to talk about how do we make this fully representative of the field, because we pose this question to one another. How do we know that what we learned so far with the first 24 people, diverse though they are, will necessarily bring the same broad results if we had done this at Davis, if we had done this at Stanford, and so on, or at GW. We also talked about the case of Ponars. Imagine if we'd done this with just Ponars members instead. Would it look the same? Oh, and you said Alex is too young to do it in oral history. Well, both Alex and I have gray hair now, so I think. But the interesting thing is that Alex's oral history, he was the last person to go in front of the microphone because we in the interviewing team first wanted to learn through the process. And so his interview was slightly different than other interviews, which were more life stories. Alex's interview was a little bit more targeted based on a lot of knowledge we had amassed. And so, he had a lot of hard-hitting questions that were about his own experience as a political scientist and how easy or difficult it was for him to come up in the 1990s when there was the rise of functional institutes like SIPA. And there were all sorts of challenges in area studies. And he and I remember we were in graduate school in the late 90s or early 2000s, and we remember some really epic departmental and administrative battles at Columbia University over the fate of area studies institutes, and some area studies institutes didn't make it. And so it was really great to have him talk about some of these experiences. Young though he is, I'll tell him that.
Okay, Jonas, we have a question.
Stefan, the speaker there, the Higgs Center for Strategic Studies, and I was at SIPA, and it was another sort of competing institute that ran UCLA. But this is not sniping. I just want to ask the question, the story you say about debunking the myth of sort of the good old days, how specific really is that to Columbia? Because I can tell you, like, Rand UCLA had an impressive concentration of area of specialty, which declined precipitously afterwards. And so the diffusion you talk about, and that Anchorman also talked about, right? So prior to this singular focus of the US government and philanthropic organizations on the Soviet Union, there was a diffusion of the state. There were some people studying Russia all over the place, teaching Russian language, Russian history, but they really came together after World War II. And what we see now is to some extent still the afterglow of that particular focus of during the Cold War. I still wonder if it hadn't been for the Cold War, and if Russia sort of were going in the direction it's going now, what would have happened to that sort of concentration? So to what extent is the sort of the debunking of the myth of the good old days specific to Columbia, where you still have a large amount of people doing this, you still have Harriman, but there's a lot of other places also in Europe where it is entirely disintegrated. So I really still think that the good old days is not just a myth, but it's really, things have changed dramatically, and we have to start thinking diffusion is not bad, but you do have to take advantage of, you have to work together in different ways. And we've not been very good, I would submit, as a community of doing that. We come together at meetings like this, we do quite a volumes, we maybe co-author some articles and stuff, but we really have not been having this sort of cumulative knowledge building that a lot of other disciplines are doing, especially in the hard sciences, where they build data sets together, where they work on these data sets, where they have 6, 7 authors producing, where they put out their research right away. So I still think that the good old days, things were better than in some ways, certainly in financial ways. And today we really have to find something else to do that. And what the story you say is interesting, but it may be very specific to Colombia, which is sort of the afterglow of the Cold War.
And we're open to that maybe the stories are too specific to that particular place. And think of it this way, what I'm telling you here is how I read the interviews.
Right.
You might have a different interpretation, and that's why they're great primary sources. Because you might read them and say, gosh, George, I think your interpretation isn't right. I would read these in a different way. Maybe it's a lot worse than you said it was, or it's a lot better than you said it was. The idea of broadening this and doing this at a lot of institutes is really great and important, because like a number of people around the room have said, this is only as good as it's recorded for posterity. People will die, people will disappear, and then the stories will be gone. And in some of these places that you're talking about where you say there's been more of a disintegration, some of those people are still around. They've directed themselves in other ways and other initiatives. And so the question that you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to pursue their stories before they're gone, to get at the truth of what happened in these places? It's very tough and it's time consuming, but it's worthwhile. I think the point that you make about how area studies builds knowledge is, you mentioned that sideways, but it's so important. That's what I think is so wonderful about PONARS, because it's an iterated coming together of scholars at this place, as well as abroad, to share work. But we can always do it better. And I know that Alex at Columbia is thinking, how can we do this in a more sustained way to build on the knowledge, to build on our findings? And one of the things that he's doing right now, partly by virtue of what he's learned from the oral history, is that he needs to have a much stronger connection to the alumni who have diffused across so many different fields, and find out better ways to bring them together. So the nice thing about this oral history is that it also has an analytical tack, and it helps you diagnose some of the things that you think can be better about your field or institution, and that's cool. And if you forget everything else that I've said today, that's totally okay. But I hope that some of you are inspired to go and to document the histories of your own institutions and the places you work with.
Okay, so we have a question in the back.
George, just with regard to the Soviet interview project that you mentioned, the Jim Millar, that was preceded a few decades by the Harvard interview project that was done with the refugees who had come out from from then the Soviet Union during the war, and that brought out some of both the benefits of oral history, but also the pitfalls. And some of the interviewers, like Joe Berliner, were excellent. Others would lead on the interviewees, or sometimes have them say misleading things. So it brings out very well some of the pitfalls as well as benefits. That project was digitized and is now available online on the Harvard Data Center website. And metadata, of course, as you mentioned, that has long been a central feature of this, and that was very carefully taken into account when that was digitized. All of the presidential libraries in this country have vast collections of oral histories. I think those are some of the best. The interviewees have been doing it for a long time and clearly know how to do it well and get people. And real challenge them if they say things that are wrong. Either
nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault when both were teenagers is speaking to the FBI about the death threats that emerged after she went public with her allegations.
They say things that are wrong either deliberately or inadvertently. The Harvard also has a large collection of oral histories with officials who came out of Iran after the 1979 revolution, and that too has been digitized and is available online, I think on the Middle East Center's website. And again, metadata were taken into account from the very beginning. This goes back to the 1980s, so it's not a new thing to think about metadata and dealing with these. There are many other oral history collections. The Hoover Institution has some excellent ones, including a large collection of former Soviet officials from the Gorbachev period to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union. The BDM Corporation, I'm not sure whether it still exists, but they compiled an enormously rich set of oral histories with former Soviet generals and the like, and those were classified at the time because they were done for the Department of Defense, but they were declassified about 10 years ago, and again, are an enormously rich source. So I'm glad that you are doing this, looking specifically at the question of the Russian studies field, but there is a very large reserve of things also already to take account.
Jonas, can you?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm David, first year student here at Elliott. My question is, how can my generation, who looks at pen and paper and we're like, what is that for, can sort of record our history so that, old generations had journals and then like email, we don't use email anymore. And you could say Twitter kind of, but not really. So how can we start recording our history in a way that is meaningful for the future?
I'll start with your question, and I'll go to Mark. Well, it's a great question, but I think oral history transcends generations and age. It's a pretty simple way to do it. You only need a recorder. That's all you need. And then churning out transcripts is so easy these days because the cost of transcription is actually quite low, whether you're doing automated transcription or you're actually going to a transcriber who bangs the stuff out. But the big question that you have to ask yourself, forget about Twitter and pen versus paper and all of this stuff. The question you have to ask is, what is it that you want to record? What is it that you want to leave for posterity, and how will you do it? I'll tell you a story. So I've been working part-time in this field in a very unlikely way for about 10 years now. And it started with the CFR Oral History Project. I went on sabbatical from UT Austin, and I went to Central Asia to do research, and then when I came back, I realized that I had no time to actually write the book, because UT being a state school only gave you 1 semester of leave. And I was sitting at Columbia with just weeks to go, and all of a sudden this proposal landed on my desk. And I thought they were just asking me to review the CFR oral history proposal, but they were secretly wondering if I'd be interested in doing the research for it. And it went from that to me becoming the primary interviewer on the project. And so I've been doing this for a while now, and one of the things that I learned in the process, and this gets to the most important thing, well, Mark, you made a number of important points, but the most important thing I want to talk about is how you know that what the narrator is telling you is accurate, and how you ensure that you get a good interview. There is no 100% accuracy, and there's no perfect interview, but as an interviewer, you are ethically obligated to go into every interview well-researched and to ask excellent questions and to do gentle steering that prevents the narrator from just telling utter tales that aren't true. There are some oral histories, unfortunately, projects that I've come across that use interviewers that are not so much unseasoned, because you can be a young interviewer and be really, really good. You can be very young and be really, really good. But you have to be willing to do a lot of research before each and every session. A lot of research. Sometime I once spent 40 hours doing research for a 1 hour and a half session, because that person's, that particular theme of that person's life was that complex, and I wanted to make sure that I was asking the right questions, accurate questions, and so on. And So if the oral history project has used a good interview team, and if there's somebody who's directing the project who then cross-references all the interviews and makes sure that everybody's on the right page with the kinds of questions they're asking and the kinds of material they're getting back, by the time you get the transcripts in your hands, even if there are, let's say, inaccuracies or tall tales in there, there won't be that many or as many, and it'll be something cleaner that you'll be able to use. But that means having a really good team of interviewers who are dedicated to putting in a lot of hours of research before they've even shaken hands with the person they're going to speak to.
We've run out of time, but please let me first express my admiration for this project, for you, George, and for Alex Cooley, and you know, wish you all the best for this project and for its continuation. And also, I think you have planted something in the minds of many people here to take the history of their institutions more seriously and think about how to record them for the future and how to make them usable for other researchers and for other generations. So please join me in thanking George Gavrilis for